Welcome to this webinar of the Gerhardt Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19, New Social Impact Ecosystem. Today, we are very honored to have with us Nick Robbins, Professor in Practice, Sustainable Finance at London School of Economics, to talk about financing a just transition to net zero. To be successful, climate action needs to deliver positive social impacts for workers and communities, particularly in developing countries. This is the agenda of the just transition, which was recognized as a critical strategy at COP26. Governments, as well as business and trade unions, along with civil society, have a greater role in making the transition fair for all. The financial sector can also play a critical role as investors, commercial banks, and development banks. In this session, Professor Robbins will focus on why finance is focusing on the just transition, what financial institutions are doing, and what needs to happen on the road to COP27 in November 2022 in Egypt. Nick joined the Grattan Research Institute in February 2018 as Professor in Practice for Sustainable Finance. He leads the Sustainable Finance Research team. The focus of his work is how to mobilize finance just transition, promoting the role of central bank and regulators in achieving sustainable development and investigating how the financial system can support restoration of nature. Nick, I mean, he has really an impressive resume. I mean, before joining the LSE, he was with the UNEP, UN Environmental, and before that, he took positions in HSBC, and before that, he was in Henderson Global Investment. Now, without much ado, let me pass to Professor Nick Robbins. Nick, it's a pleasure to have you with us, sir. Floor is yours.
Well, Ali, thank you so much for the generous introduction. Really looking forward to this session. It's great to meet another professor in practice. I think we should set up an international association. So very good. Thanks for welcoming you, and really good to have this session with the American University in Cairo and the Gerhardt Center. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to speak for about 25 minutes or so, and really looking forward to the questions about how finance can not only support climate action, but do it in a way that is socially just as we move ahead after the COP26 in Glasgow. So here we go. Okay, Ali, is that all okay? Yeah, you can see that all? Brilliant. Okay. So first off, and in the words of Pope Francis, climate change itself is a brutal act of injustice, particularly to the world's poor, to developing countries, an injustice in terms of who is creating the issue through the carbon pollution, and also who is impacted. And we know that the countries and communities that are most impacted by climate change are developing countries. So the question of justice is at the heart of action around climate change. And we need to think about them when we're thinking about solutions to climate change. This is the agenda of the just transition. I think increasingly recognized as a critical enabling factor. Climate success means creating positive social impacts for workers, for communities, for countries. We're having a lot of momentum now on this in terms of governments, in terms of businesses, finance and trade unions, and COP26. And I'll look into this a little bit. The last big climate summit last year at Glasgow really marked a step forward. Now, clearly, this year, a lot of the climate discussion is going to be focused on Sharm el-Sheikh, the COP27, which will be hosted by Egypt in November. And what I'll hopefully point to is some of the things the financial sector can do to scale up action on climate and getting to the net zero target, but also how we can deliver that through a just transition. So what can investors do to help reallocate capital and also help to shape the financial system response? So firstly, I'd just like to set out the strategic imperative of the just transition, and then I'll turn to the financial sector response. I'll be focusing mostly on the role of investors, but happy to talk about the role of banks and also development banks in the discussion as we run through. So the first is really thinking strategically about the transition to a net zero economy. This is a huge opportunity. It's a hugely positive opportunity. Managed well, this will boost employment, more jobs in a green economy. It will reduce inequality, revive communities, improve health, because a lot of carbon pollution is associated with air pollution, and of course, avoid catastrophic climate change. It's a real win-win. However, if we don't manage this process of change well, we're not just going to see stranded assets, which many investors are concerned about, for example, in the fossil fuel sector, but we also could see stranded workers, stranded communities, and even stranded countries. If we think about the industrialized countries and what happened in that process of deindustrialization, the sort of rust belt that happened, we definitely don't want to see that happening again in the process to the net zero economy. So again, huge upside. There's something that we really need to manage to ensure we don't have these downside consequences. Just transition is a term, a concept, a strategy that's come out of the trade union movement, but it's inside the Paris Agreement as a way of ensuring that this shift is delivered in accordance with the creation of decent work, which is a sort of global commitment through the ILO, and also quality jobs, and obviously very clearly linked to nationally determined priorities. So different countries are different. So it's in the Paris Agreement, and the ILO, the International Labour Organization, has actually set out the same year, 2015, also a set of guidelines for governments and others about how to deliver a just transition. And how that can deliver decent work in the workplace, workers, also broader social inclusion, and the eradication of poverty. So very, very linked to the whole Sustainable Development Goals agenda. One of the things is obviously that this is focusing on the world of work, on workers, and I think really sees workers as key agents in climate action. That these workers have the billions of workers around the world are a key agent of climate action, particularly in terms of employment and the need to focus on the quantity of employment. As I said, this will be a job creator, the shift to net zero economy, but also the quality of those jobs to make sure that they are high quality jobs with fair conditions. So that's one of the key priorities in terms of the workplace. Social dialogue, particularly ensuring that workers are involved in and participate in the design and delivery of climate plans in the businesses they work with. And the phrase here that was much heard in Glasgow, nothing about us without us. So social dialogue is a key element of just transition for workers. Clearly skills. Workforces, obviously workers have huge skills, expertise, and so on, which is really vital to deploy in terms of the innovations we need for the net zero transition. But also we're going to need new skills for the new sectors, moving from, let's say, the oil and gas sector to the renewables sector, petroleum cars to electric vehicles, hydrogen, and so on. And we all need to think about social protection, obviously ensuring adequate incomes, particularly pensions, as maybe people move sectors and so on, how to ensure their pensions are secure, also health and social security. And also, this is all underpinned by well-established rights at work, international labor standards, and human rights. And again, often the whole issue of the gender dimension of the just transition comes up, particularly about the empowerment of women in the workplace. So that's a key issue. If we're thinking about the just transition, really focus on the needs and interests of workers. But as I think people have been thinking about implementing the just transition, I think we look at the needs and interests of workers in this broader context. It's not necessarily just thinking about workers in a particular factory inside the factory fence. It's thinking about long-term supply chains, particularly into developing countries, how to ensure that human rights are supported there. It also means thinking about communities. If, for example, fossil fuel industries are being phased down and phased out in certain countries, what about the surrounding communities in particular places? How are those areas thought about, so we don't have stranded communities and so on? And then also questions of consumers. Consumers obviously are going to be affected. We still have many consumers who don't have access to modern, clean energy, and often cost of energy is too high, particularly at the moment. So this is, I suppose, extending the view of the just transition from workers through the supply chain to communities, and then to the consumer consumers as well. Now, the just transition, I think, has sort of shown itself to be vital, particularly when it's not being pursued actively by governments and others. And I think 2 years after COP, with the election of President Trump, I think that was a real signal that one of the reasons that President Trump gave for pulling America out of the Paris Agreement was the supposed impact on workers, and particularly coal miners. So we could see how sort of concerns about job losses could be manipulated for political purposes. And then in Europe, we also had the Gilets jaunes protests, the yellow vests, who were protesting about this was from a consumer perspective, the impact of a carbon tax on vehicles. And this phrase which came out from the Gilets jaunes, I think, really exemplifies some of the social issues around the climate transition. You think about the end of the world, but we worry about the end of the week. So clearly, I think those were two big signals about what would happen to climate policy in the transition if we didn't actively and deliberately think about the interests of workers and communities and design policies so that they are fair for all. And this response is happening. Certainly, if we look at two major economies, the European Union, President Ursula von der Leyen very clearly in the EU's Green Deal, making clear that the transition will either be working for all and be just, or will not work at all. And the EU has a dedicated just transition mechanism to invest in particular regions that may be affected by the shift away from fossil fuels in particular. Joe Biden, in his strategy for climate change, I mean, the words he uses is that climate change action is about jobs, jobs, jobs. And this is not just about the quantity of jobs, but this question of quality, good paying union jobs, which will deliver an equitable, so a fair, clean energy future. So I think if we look at the US and the EU, I think we're seeing a response to those I suppose, upsets in terms of climate policy coming through. But I'd really like to suggest that the just transition is particularly important for developing countries. And here, I think it's really important to signal the role of South Africa. Cyril Ramaphosa, President of South Africa, I think has really made the important point about the critical need for a just transition for developing countries. South Africa's commitment to reduce its fair share of emissions and do so in the context of overcoming poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment. And therefore, it must be a just transition. I think if we're looking at one country in the developing world that's really taken a leadership position, I would cite South Africa. So I think we're starting to see this policy response coming through in many countries. So COP26, November last year in Glasgow, many things were agreed there about sort of core climate areas, but one thing that was very significant was how the just transition had moved from one line in the Paris Agreement to be mentioned throughout the so-called Glasgow Pact, but in many, many other initiatives as well by governments, by business and finance, really showing how it is an essential factor in delivering climate success. So the first is in the Glasgow Pact, the official outcome of Glasgow, with an explicit link making between the just transition and aligning financial flows. Secondly, there was an explicit government declaration led by the UK government, but with 16 other industrialized country governments, the US and Canada, the EU and many others, really highlighting the importance of social dialogue and decent work, local action, supply chains in the delivery of goals. Then I think the most exciting area was the announcement of South Africa with a number of its development partners, the EU, Germany, France, US, UK, of a just transition energy partnership with $8.5 billion in terms of international climate finance to support South Africa in its move towards decarbonisation, so moving away from being a coal-based economy and ensuring that employment and livelihoods are considered. So this is really, I think, the sort of maybe the sort of the best-in-class example of how countries can move forward. Very much still at the early stage, but a really inspiring example. Then a couple of things outside the government area. At Glasgow, as many of you will know, a new initiative was launched, the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. 450 institutions from around the world, banks, insurers, investors, and so on, really building on a number of earlier activities in those sectors, and really setting out that all these institutions will draw up net zero transition plans, how all their portfolios will be aligned with net zero emissions before 2050. And interestingly, setting out the just transition is best practice for that. So the big banks of the world, the big investors of the world, the big insurers of the world are all in the process of designing net zero plans, and they're now thinking through how they can incorporate just transition in that. And then from the business sector, I think as businesses recognize how they're going to need to get their business models down to net zero, they're starting to think about their people, their workers, their supply chain, their communities, and so on. And at Glasgow, we had the first business-led framework for just transition in the energy sector with companies such as Anglo American, BP, ENI, Reliance, Repsol, and SSE involved. And that was with the Council for Inclusive Capitalism and also the Vatican. So I think a number of real signals and momentum of what is going on. So let's think about the financial system response. In a sense, hopefully I've given you a sense of why just transition is so important for climate action. The next question is really, why should the financial system, financial actors, financial institutions, why should they really be bothering about this? Isn't this just something for governments? So in terms of the why, I think there is a really powerful rationale for financial sector action. Net zero is the sort of the goal where we want to deliver in terms of reducing emissions. Obviously, we need to make our economies resilient to climate impacts as well. But just transition, I think, is very much coming through as the how. As we think about how to deliver that, how we bring people involved as workers, as in the supply chain, as communities, and as consumers. So firstly, what's the rationale for financial sector action? Well, firstly, it's the right thing to do. It's about applying long-established human rights and labour standards to this transformational shift in the economy to a net zero economy. And it means shaping that shift to deliver positive social impact. So all the banks, all the investors, all the insurance firms who've signed up to human rights standards, labour standards, the just transition is, in a sense, you're already committed to. It's about applying this to the global energy transition. Secondly, it's a necessary thing to do. That actually, as we've seen, the just transition is important to build the public trust and support in the transition to make sure we don't have a backlash against action. And therefore, for financial institutions, a just transition reduces systemic risks to the transition taking place. And the third, it's a smart thing to do, because as we move to the net zero economy, we're going to need to build up so-called social capital and human capital in the workplace to enable this net zero economy to be successful. And that's, again, one of the core deliverables of a just transition. So these, I think, this is, I suppose, coming out of the experience. We've been working with investors and banks for sort of almost 5 years now. I think these three reasons are the ones which are driving investors and banks to really think seriously about just transition. And it's really something for every financial institution and for every asset class. So if that's the why, what are the areas? And here I'm going to focus mostly on the role of institutional investors, asset managers, pension funds, insurance firms, and so on. I think the same basic structure applies for banks as well. We can discuss that when we come to the Q&A. So what can investors do? Obviously, incorporate just transition into their investment strategy, make it a part of corporate shareholder engagement with the companies they own, incorporate into capital allocation decisions, into the dialogue and advocacy that investors have with governments and with partnerships with governments, and then obviously in terms of the learning and review they do, in terms also of their disclosures. Now, as you'll see, none of these 5 priorities for action are anything new. And that is really important. The just transition is not a separate activity for investors, but should be one which is integrated and embedded into the core actions they're doing and into their core climate strategies. So I just want to illustrate these 3 of these aspects with some examples, and then I'll just finish off with some thoughts about heading towards COP27. So the first is shareholder engagement, and this has obviously been is a major activity, the responsibility of investors on behalf of their clients, individual shareholders, to ensure that the company that they're investing in are abiding by best practice environmental, social governance principles. And shareholder engagement is really now a powerful tool, broadly used across international markets in the US, in Europe, in Africa, other parts and in Asia, Latin America, Australia, Japan, and so on. And I think what is interesting is how climate activism in shareholder engagement has really stepped up, particularly through initiatives such as the Climate Action 100, and the Just Transition is becoming part of that. And we've seen some very, very positive results of that. So one company, UK-based company called SSE, again, a leader in terms of net zero. Some of its shareholders at an annual general meeting in 2020 also asked the management about what they were doing about just transition, and that prompted the delivery, I think, of probably one of the world's first corporate just transition plans, which you can see set out here, thinking about the issues involving workers and communities and consumers about transitioning into a net zero world. What are the principles for good green jobs? What are the principles for consumer fairness? So interesting how this energy utility is thinking about consumer fairness, and also about principles for the community involvement in new assets, so sharing value with communities. And then also what the principles on just transition are about moving out of the high carbon world, moving out of coal, moving out of gas. So again, what does that mean for the people who are in these high carbon jobs? What does it mean for the communities around that? So 20 principles, and I think a very, very good sort of first generation response from corporate actors. A review that was done by the World Benchmarking Alliance just before COP, however, said that these type of strategies are still in a minority, and only a handful of the 100+ companies that they analyze in the energy sector have these just transition plans. So clearly more to be done by shareholders in their shareholder engagement to ensure that companies have credible policies on just transition. So that's one of the first action points, shareholder engagement. The second, obviously, is allocating capital. And clearly, investors are allocating huge amounts of capital to green assets, a huge demand for that, which we see, obviously, in the green bond market with record issuance of green bonds around the world in the last year into green infrastructure, private equity, and also, obviously, into the listed equity markets. So I think this is where we're thinking about how can we add the social dimension to green. The COVID crisis has obviously been a boost to the social bond market, but we see a real potential for delivering what we're calling sort of green plus products, where capital is raised for delivery of green purposes, renewable energy, building efficiency, sustainable transport, but with deliberate social criteria incorporated. And this is something which has come through in the UK, which is my country, where the government in its green sovereign bond, which was first issued last year, and has now raised about £16 billion, the government is committed to report on the social co-benefits of the green spending, which I think is a really good step forward and could be considered by other countries issuing green sovereign bonds. India today, also in the recent days, has also said it's going to deliver a green sovereign bond. And again, integrating the social would be a really good point there. I mentioned that the community dimension of just transition is really important, that the just transition is really felt in particular places. And therefore, I think a role for investors is allocating capital into so-called place-based investments, particularly thinking about new investments that are going to generate jobs and sort of community and regional diversification. So this is much more about real assets, infrastructure, real estate, private debt, and private equity. So a lot of interest in these place-based investments. And just one thing you might want to check out is a report from the G7 Impact Investing Task Force, which came out last year, and the link is on the screen, but you'll see it in the slides, which sets out a very interesting process for how just transition factors can be incorporated across a whole set of different asset classes. So capital allocation, the second example I wanted to share with you, and then the third is policy and partnerships. Investors are talking with governments all the time about what they need to see in terms of macroeconomic policy, but also increasingly in terms of climate policy and what they need to see in terms of carbon pricing or renewables policy or transport policy. And increasingly, investors are also recognizing they need governments to deliver on just transition. Investors can't really on their own deliver green skills. They need governments to have effective green skills, green jobs policies. They need governments to be thinking about industrial policy, to be thinking about regional policy and macroeconomic policy. So really supporting the just transition in national policy is a key role for investors, and in these nationally determined contributions that all countries need to make as part of the UN process. The second is then, I suppose, partnerships with public finance, particularly development banks, multilateral development banks such as the World Bank or the African Development Bank or so on, but also national development banks, because these agencies are the ones which can help move the economic frontier and also crowd in private capital. So I think that's a real area for partnership. And then standards. Investors, banks need and need really clear standards which are about expectations, about governance, and about reporting. And I think contributing to these standards is a really important area for partnership. And for example, in this GFANZ, the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. So that would be another priority. So I'm going to close now and really think as we move towards COP27, a picture of one of the Egyptian delegation at COP26. I think everybody's looking forward now to the Sharm el-Sheikh summit, which will be held in November in Egypt. I hope I've given you a sense about the growing momentum about just transition as a policy issue, but also the growing adoption of this by financial institutions and what financial institutions are already doing and what really should be happening next. So these are 5 priorities we sort of derived from what is happening at COP and what really is going to be needed going into the COP27. So firstly is really to make this imperative of just transition really integral to the net zero transition plans, which all financial institutions are now needing to develop. So taking from the sort of high level imperative into practical planning tools by banks and insurers and pension funds and asset managers. That's the first priority. The second, obviously, is to focus on emerging and developing countries, where the greatest need for capital is to develop a net zero economy, but often where sources of capital are not available and costs of capital can be very high. So I think focusing on some of these tools and partnerships, such as the one in South Africa, to increase flows of public finance around the just transition will be really important this year. Then we need to see real tailored financial instruments by investors, by banks, by capital markets, things where the just transition becomes really crystallized into a new bond issuance or a new loan raising by bank or a new set of infrastructure investments. So I think exemplifying that with some real world examples is going to be really important. Then the fourth priority, this whole question of dialogue and participation. I think one of the factors that financial institutions in their due diligence of companies and investments really needs to look at the quality of the involvement of workers and communities in these climate plans. I think that's really a quality mark, is how much workers have been involved, that their full expertise has been recognized and involved and incorporated by management. And then what I was just discussing, the important point of linking the financial sector, investors, and also banks and so on, into their dialogue with governments to ensure that policy on climate is really supporting the just transition, so that we have the rules and incentive which can really mobilize the long-term investment. There are many things that we've written about this over the past years. A first guide for investors back in 2018, and these slides will be made available, I think, to you by Ali and his team. But with that, I'm going to stop and hand back to you, Ali, and hope I didn't talk too fast.
Thank you, Nick. It was actually very clear and to the point. Please, if you have questions, either you can write them on the chat box or raise your hands, and I will ask you a few questions, Nick, just to sort of allow our participants to warm up a little bit. I've read one of your reports, and you said that there is an unprecedented support, yet actual delivery remains at early stage. Now, when you talk about this, is this only for the just transition, or is it just a transition at large, net zero?
No, great question, Ali. I think this was talking specifically about just transition, but I think you can apply it generally to net zero as well, that we have unprecedented commitments, both by industrial sectors, but also by banks and investors to net zero overall. Yeah, so 450 institutions, but particularly for just transition, it's somewhat newer. And so probably there are, I don't know, 5 or 10 large corporations who are now starting to take it seriously. But as we've seen with climate generally, the shape of the curve is not smooth. I think the shape of the curve is going to be like this, quite steep, that people will see rapid adoption this year. It's not going to be a sort of a steady state evolution. I think it's going to be quite discontinuous this year.
Okay. Now, for us in Egypt, I'm very interested to compare your experiences or your observations of the UK versus India, for example.
Right.
Or maybe South Africa. I mean, they're probably going to be closer to us. What are the major differences when you look at from the point of view of a just transition? How do you mobilize the investment, the banks, even development banks, UK versus Africa, South Africa or India?
Yeah. No, really good point. So we've been working with CDC, the UK's DFI, in a partnership with groups in both India and South Africa. I mean, a few things that have really come through, I think, let's say start with India. First, I think the role of the state looms larger. You often have the state-owned enterprises in the fossil fuel sector. The coal mining industry is owned by the state, as well as some of the major energy companies as well. So that the role of the state is a larger issue. Clearly, these are countries where sort of fundamental development objectives have still to be achieved in terms of eliminating poverty and in terms of reducing inequality and in terms of many of the sort of rights at work issues. In terms of so that's a challenge. And then particularly coming through in the India case in discussions has been this whole question of the informal economy. A lot of employment is in the informal economy. So this is quite a different context. So I think that's some of the areas. South Africa, I think, as I suggested, has been one of the areas where just transition has been advanced probably as long as many other countries. And I think some of the things that are coming through there is the recognition from sort of local pension funds, local development banks, and interestingly, we had a discussion at the central bank as well about how this issue of not just the climate goal, but the making sure that this hit wider development goals. So I think there's a broader sort of system view, and I think some really interesting discussions, particularly thinking around what happens as essentially coal assets and by extension other fossil fuel assets are wound down probably earlier than expected because of the climate reasons. So how do you think about early closure, and what do you think about new livelihoods for these areas? And often, particularly for mining, these are rural areas. Yeah, these are rural areas, and you will no longer have, let's say, coal mining as the major source of employment and income. What then becomes this new source of rural economy? Yeah, new source of rural economy, agriculture, maybe forestry, and certainly in India. But also, how is this going to be high value? Yeah, how is this going to be high value addition? How does it link to the digital economy and so on? So this whole question about the sort of the economy that comes next, particularly in the rural economy, comes through as a really strong point.
One last question, and then I'm going to start taking questions from the audience. Most of us in developing countries, when I hear the just term or environmental justice, unlike in the Western or developed countries where they think within the same country, the underprivileged and the privileged, I think from developing versus developed. Most of the developing countries did not contribute to the pollution. But when you look at the impact of the pollution, it's actually impacting. I mean, Africa in particular, it's really devastated by the climate change. So for me, I mean, if you think, because that's going to lead you to COP27, and what is the Africa agenda? And I think it was probably started talking about this. I mean, many of the presidents in Africa, including our own, started to talk about climate justice from a point of view of developing versus developed. I just want to get your view on this.
Well, I think that's absolutely spot on, Ali, and that's why I started with in a sense this question of climate change as a factor of injustice. Climate change is a cause of injustice. It's mostly been the problem is being caused by the industrialized countries. So the industrialized countries have the responsibility, and those who are impacted are mostly in developing countries who have had little or no real contribution to it. Africa, South Asia, and other developing countries. So absolutely. So the just transition, I think, has to be seen within this broader climate justice piece. Yeah, and it means that we don't want to sort of, in a sense, replicate injustices as we take solutions to it. And importantly, I think it's also showing that actually there is obviously the obligation for industrialized countries to make available climate finance, to actually keep the promises that have been made, the famous 100 billion in terms of climate finance, which has not been met. Absolutely important, and just transition should be part of this. But I think also this is the opportunity, particularly continents such as Africa, the opportunity of moving to renewables is huge in terms of the potential for moving to renewables, the potential for that having distribution of energy across the continent. So I think absolutely just transition is part of this wider climate justice element, and it does require industrialized countries, I think, to sort of step up in terms of honoring their public finance pledges, the 100 billion, but also then thinking about how that private capital can be attracted. How could Egypt or other Africa attract more investor capital, more foreign institutional capital, by developing a really attractive just transition approach?
Okay. I'm going to start taking questions from the audience. I'll start with Quintin. Please unmute yourself, sir. And if you want to, please, yes.
Hi, yes. So thank you for the presentation first. So I'm Quintin I'm in Glasgow. And so you talked about standards as well as policies. And I was wondering about the role of supranational bodies, especially the European Union, because they have the green taxonomy and stuff like that, where they bring in new directives. What could be the role of these bodies in bringing change?
Well, Quintin, very good to hear from you, and good to hear that you're speaking from Glasgow. So we're making a connection between Scotland and Egypt already. So that's great. So yes, I mean, one of the issues around the just transition is that can be seen as a very sort of heavy phrase. I mean, justice is a very big, serious concept, and obviously, particularly business, workers, and finance need this to be broken down into operational standards. So absolutely right. So I think that's going to be a big focus this year, alongside green taxonomies, which the EU has been leading, as you know, to identify what is green. The idea of a social taxonomy is coming alongside in the EU. Certainly discussions in India about when it's developing its sustainable finance taxonomy. There have been discussions about how just transition should be recognized. So I think the standards, certainly in the taxonomy sense, I think this will be the year where people will be looking at how this fits, for example, in terms of reporting requirements, particularly as governments start thinking through transition plans. Because banks and corporates and so on, don't want to have to constantly reinvent the wheel. They're going to want to know what are the expectations, what are the metrics, and then the plans can be put in place. So it's a really important point. And I think obviously we want to start with some things which are practical and can be delivered, and then move to greater sophistication and not get sort of the perfect being the enemy of the good, you sort of mean. So let's start and get real practice going, and then improve and refine as we're going along.
Thank you.
Thank you, Quintin. James, please unmute yourself.
Hi, my name is Jim Stoner. I want to congratulate you on an excellent presentation and with the values and perspectives I happen to agree with. I have an institutional question to follow the previous institutional question. The world's business schools currently are rowing in the opposite direction to what you're advocating. In fact, they're supporting, with very few important exceptions, they're supporting business as usual at its worst in their teaching and research. What can you all do to wake up the world's business schools whose curriculum should be deeply grounded in the values and approaches that you talk about? That's the question.
Jim, great question. I work obviously in a school which has a management school. I'm not familiar with the current curricula of business schools, but let's take your point at face value. And when I was certainly I've been teaching at business schools and so on, I think there's growing interest in the sort of social dimensions, sustainability, and so on. But it seems often to be an option. It's the option on a Saturday afternoon, so it's not core. And if in many ways you're thinking about the future leaders of tomorrow, and they're going into industries, their ability to understand how to manage a transition like this, that's going to be key. Not only the financial aspects, the technological aspects, the organizational aspects, but this issue about how these different pieces come together in terms of people. So I would say this does need to be an area of priority. And it's not something I'm not directly in business schools, but that would be an area. And one thing is important is this, that lends itself to capacity building. And I'm sure Ali, your organization really can contribute this. I work a lot with central banks, and the key thing that they're continually talking to us about, whether that's central banks in Europe or central banks in Africa or Latin America, is this capacity building and actually making sure that curricula for the financial sector is really fit for purpose for the world we're moving into. So a great point, Jim. And I think this, I mean, actually the thought comes to me actually how we could develop modules for business school students, which will be relevant around just transition. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, not as a business school teacher, I'd be happy to explore that further.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Jim. Lauren, please, would you unmute yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm here from Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. How are you doing?
Hi.
So I enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much. My question is stemming from the role of sustainable technology and land development, specifically when we're talking about organic farmers and their contribution and sometimes being overlooked as a powerhouse for when we talk about what's going on with global warming and these other environmental factors. And unfortunately, how a lot of them are kind of being pushed to the side in a way where their methodologies and techniques are not being examined or being looked at by many of the larger organizations, by many of the larger international organizations. So same in Egypt, you have Egyptian farmers, women and men, who are finding ways and trying to be very creative and trying to find, you know, more organic ways of crop cultivation, development, telling to recycle the use of seeds and everything like that. And you're also finding certain movements going on here in the States where people are trying to do the very same thing. So my question is, are there any initiatives or any form of documentation that you have found that is being examined by, you know, the IM or these other major international organizations that are looking at agriculture and global and how in connection to global warming, they're trying to say, you know what, let's go and take a look at these, the low men on the totem pole, as we're saying, let's go and look at the foundational workers who are doing this work to, and are finding very creative and innovative practices in doing this because they're not being really overlooked, not really being funded in the way that they could be funded. And so it's missing out on a very large opportunity to really combat these particular problems that we're dealing with when we're talking about global warming. And of course, I mean, and also not only just, we're looking at farmers, not only in Egypt as well, but even certain local movements happening in Egypt by the youth and other people who are you know, doing the work of, you know, sustainable, you know, recycling and other types of things, neighborhood development that are more organic the whole going green, and of course seeing it here in even urban sectors in the United States as well, where they're trying to redevelop the notion of the urban environment and make it more agriculture and sustainable to live in. So have any of those been, any major studies or a big push, has that happened in order to get that conversation more on the table and for people to take it and take it seriously? Thank you.
Yeah, no, really great question, Laura. Thanks for raising. I think, as you were seeing when I was discussing, most of what I was discussing was about the energy system largely, and I think that's where people have been thinking about climate, is about move from fossil fuels to renewables and so on. But you're quite right. Clearly, we need to think about the sort of what we're calling just nature, thinking about actually land use, agriculture, deforestation, and so on. And so that's actually an area we're just about starting doing some research. And I think it also means that you think about maybe the needs of different stakeholders. So obviously you would want to think about rural workers, but also smallholders. I mean, how can they be pursuing this transition to sustainable agriculture, which also delivers these wider social benefits for communities and so on. I think there's a real opportunity for this move to a sort of positive climate, nature positive economy to actually be a job creator in rural economy, agricultural economies. But clearly there are going to be issues around sort of supply chain dynamics and sort of concentration up the supply chain, maybe some of the big food retailers and so on. And then one of the things we're hearing as well, Lauren, is actually this area of sort of agriculture and net zero and just transition is people at the banks are starting to think about what their role is. I think they've really started to get their heads around the energy side, but they realize that the agricultural sector is one where perhaps it's less developed. So I think you really put your finger on a sort of a really emerging area. And of course, Egypt does have some real organic pioneers, particularly in the sort of the cotton area, which is great to highlight. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Lauren. Ghada Hamouda, please unmute yourself. Floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you so much. Very interesting presentation. I am the Chief Sustainability and Marketing Officer for an investment holding company that does have energy and renewables in its mix, but we also have the other extreme of cement. And as I listen and try to consider the shifts that we are seeing happening in the private sector considerations and pressures on it to be more responsible, I just question a few things. One, we have abundance of gas. Is transitioning to gas, which is 50% less in emissions, is that greener? Is that responsible enough? Because I do believe it should be, because what's sustainable is what's available. So there's that whole discussion as we're hosting COP27 about gas, transitioning to gas, and building an entire infrastructure for that, and what that could do to greener solutions. And then secondly, I'd like to hear your views on carbon credits, and as a potentially a solution for companies to try, as it's trying to fix its own internals and practices, to also buy into this, to help in Egypt or globally also, to help it transition and achieve the net zero objective. And finally, this whole incentives to the private sector. I mean, obviously, this is more efficient is an incentive in terms of your consumption. It saves you money now that there are no subsidies, but ultimately to try to do all the changes required in your entire supply chain is and what else could be done from a government perspective to try to. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Ghada, for those questions. Really, really spot on again. We heard, I think, from Quentin earlier, this question of taxonomies, and many of you who will be following the sustainable finance debate know there's a big fight going on within the European Union about whether natural gas should be included within the EU sustainable taxonomy as a sort of under certain conditions as part of the transition. So obviously the transition is going to take many decades. So this is what I think the natural gas issue is one of the ones which a lot of focus on now. I think pretty much everybody agrees that the coal clearly will need to be phased down, phased out. Gas, I think, is where a lot of attention. So very important to get this right in Egypt. overall, we are going to need to move away from gas. But then the question is, what would countries like Egypt, which have abundant gas, what do they do in the meantime? How can they, are they able to use gas in a way to develop hydrogen? Is there options for capturing the emissions that would be used in that process through carbon capture and storage? Does that work geologically? Does that work financially in Egypt and other countries? And again, how do we become more efficient in the use of gas as we move? Again, this is a transition. We're not talking about things needing to happen in overnight move to zero, but we're talking about decades process from now up until 2050. So I think you put your finger on the gas issue, but I would say that probably particularly international investors, both public and private, will be increasingly reluctant to invest in new gas assets. And I think that's going to be because of the sort of results coming out of the International Energy Agency, that really for the world's net zero target, there is no need for new oil and gas assets. Yeah. So we really need to think about living within our existing assets. So if we have existing assets, how do we use those more efficiently, and potentially how we can use those in the transition process, but essentially no new assets. You also talked about, and then I think you pointed to in your holdings about cement. And I think this is where so-called these hard to abate sectors, the steel, the cement and so on, and that's where a lot of interest is, both about sort of how we develop sort of fundamental technological transformations, which is happening in the steel sector, using hydrogen in the process, and a lot of interest being put into cement as well. How do you actually fundamentally decarbonize the cement process? And then carbon credits, which is your point. Again, an area which has huge potential, but I think there's a certain concern in the market that carbon credits could be used as a form of greenwashing, and could be used to delay the fundamental transformations we need to have. So clearly, COP26 led to some progress on carbon trading, the so-called Article 6, and there's a big interest now in these voluntary carbon markets. I think, again, we had the question of standards earlier. I think it'll be important really to show the integrity of these carbon credits. And in a sense, they're used as the last option. Once you've reduced your emissions, changed your process, become more efficient, you think about the offsetting as you move towards zero, not as an alternative to. And I suppose that would be the approach. So again, carbon offsets, particularly in nature-based solutions, really important for Africa. But also, I think making sure that Africa gets the right, if African countries are going to be delivering carbon credits and carbon offsets, they get the right price for it, and don't sell carbon credits too cheap to international markets.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghada. Before I take another question from the audience, I have just one comment. It's interesting when you look at the political economy dimension of what you're talking about. And I'm going to give you a specific example. The relation between Russia and Europe at large, especially with the Ukraine crisis, which has been going for a while. Germany is a country that used to rely on nuclear power to generate electricity. Now they phased away completely nuclear power, and they were using natural gas, which was imported from Russia. Now this was cut. Now in the last 2-3 years, Germany started to rely on a commodity that is very abundant there, which is coal. You see what I'm saying? I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, it's actually against, and it's coming from a country that is developed. And I think with the current crisis of Ukraine, you might find many of those coming out. Just want to get your view about this.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really, I mean, this is why, I mean, we're not just talking in the sort of the high politics of climate summits and so on, but really, as you say, the geopolitics, and we're seeing that really highlighted at the moment with the gas crisis. I think with all environmental solutions, the starting point is always to be more efficient in consumption, and that is certainly the case with gas. And where we've probably made least progress, I think the renewables is really going ahead fantastically in terms of price reductions, but we're not making the progress we need to see in our buildings, our new buildings in Egypt or any country, and in terms of actually making sure we retrofit our existing buildings So in places like Germany, or I live, the UK, that they become fuel efficient, yeah. And obviously in Egypt that you have much more efficient cooling systems and so on. So one of the things that I think will be one of the results that will be from the current crisis is a massive investment in fuel efficiency to reduce the demand for gas, particularly in buildings, but potentially also in power and also in industry. One of the things that struck me in my days in the financial markets in the UK, again, industrialized country, but energy consumption peaked in 2005. Yeah, so energy and so the big focus, I think, big issue is going to be a big focus coming out of this gas crisis is going to be long-term retrofitting. So you reduce your dependence on gas, as well as a technology shift towards electricity, again, in cold countries towards heat pumps in particular. But I think your question about the geopolitics, this is not easy. This is really serious, yeah, and really, again, if we think about many developing African countries whose real incomes and economies are based on oil and gas, yeah, are based on exports. It's not just it's not a source of energy generation. It's a source of foreign currency. It's a source of government revenue, and so on. These are very tough questions, and very serious responses are needed.
Thank you. Now I'm going to introduce you to another professor of practice, my colleague, Professor Blair, Angus Blair. Angus, please, floor is yours. Please unmute.
Nick, can you hear me? Thank you very much for your presentation and very necessary discussion. And Ali, for organizing this. I sent Nick the question by mistake on the side, but I mentioned it directly. My background, Nick, is in the city in investment banking and asset management. But I think that there continues to be great movement in finance across the world, increasingly and rightly, to try to tackle the necessary change in reducing emissions and other factors. But I have a concern that over the last year, we've seen quite considerable pushback for ESG. And with Danone, where the CEO was pushed out by hedge funds and others, I'm concerned by that movement, although heartened by noise from BlackRock. My issue, I think, is that it's still going to be too slow, given we just had 2 storms in the UK and major damage too in certain areas. My concern is that it's not going to be quickly enough, and that the governments and stock markets are going to have to regulate to insist upon meeting targets. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, Angus, really good point. And I think sometimes, I mean, I suppose, I know societies and markets move where you have a sort of a surge in interest in something. So we have had this whole surge in ESG, which is great. So more financial institutions taking account of ESG. And I think we've had these two responses to that, Angus. One is in a sense, the pushback maybe from some of the more short-term minded hedge funds and so on, the pushback against Danone, and maybe what could be seen to be happening around Unilever as well, again, as another leader there. So you have pushback perhaps, and people saying, well, no, I'm only interested in the short term. But then you also have concern about the quality of all these ESG commitments, the so-called greenwashing, and actually do these firms, ESG commitments, do they make the blindest bit of difference about how they invest and what they invest in? So I think you have both those reactions. And it does mean that you will need to think about regulatory interventions, as you're saying. I mentioned in my presentation that we're moving from a sort of question of purely thinking about climate as a risk, as a distant risk for finance. In the UK, big firms and financial firms, asset managers will be required to publish their net zero transition plans on a sort of comply or explain basis. So really starting to say, this is a national target. We have most of the world now covered. Governments have now issued net zero plans. These are serious. Therefore, business and finance, we expect you to deliver similar plans for how you're going to align your business models or your portfolios as well. And that's, I think, in the financial sector, then going to be followed up by action by the central banks. Yeah. So we're going to see more central banks who are obviously starting to do stress testing of portfolios and so on, also starting to say, are your net zero plans, are they adequate? Do they have integrity? So they're not risking greenwashing. Are they adequate to managing your risks? And do they add up for the financial system? And of course, one of those factors in that will be just transition. So I think you put your finger on a piece where this sort of the importance of regulation is going to come in. And as we know, we want regulation which is really targeted, because regulation is expensive. Regulation creates costs, and regulation can create barriers to entry to new innovators and so on. So regulation is necessary, but let's make sure we design it right.
Thank you, Angus. Nick, I mean, we're 8 o'clock now, so I really want to thank you for a very insightful webinar. It's really a mind opener, a great discussion, and great presentation. And I'm sure I mean, at least this is the first time we talk about just transition or environmental justice in this platform, the Gerhard Center webinar series. And I really appreciate your contribution. Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks, Annie, and I hope we can partner and collaborate on the road to Sharm el-Sheikh and beyond. It's really good dialogue we've had this evening. So
you bet on it. I'll be in touch with you. I mean, give me just a few weeks, and I'll probably 1 week or two, and I'll get in touch with you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Please share the slides. Thank you so much.
I will. Thank you all for participating in this webinar, and I look forward in seeing you on Monday. On Monday, we're going to have David Peter-Stroh. David Peter-Stroh is, he has a book. It's called The System Thinking for Social Change. And he's one of the real influential people in systems dynamics in general. This is really a 101 presentation if you're an expert in system thinking. But we keep talking about systemic change. And you cannot talk about systemic change without really talking about what is system dynamic. And this is the topic of our webinar on Monday, February 7th, at 7 p.m. Thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you all on future GC webinars. Stay safe. Close this. Thank you, Nick, again. Can we stop the live streaming?